Morning, everybody. Welcome back to part two. For those of you that were here at the previous meeting, I presented Hamburger Hill, the battle for Hamburger Hill, and mostly talked about aviation operations. Today, it's my honor to be able to introduce Col Bresnahan. He was one of the only surviving platoon leaders on the ground on Hamburger Hill. And an interesting personal note, I didn't meet him until some 30 years later, after he got back to the States and survived Hamburger Hill. He asked to go to flight school. He didn't want to carry a rucksack and a rifle anymore. He came back to my little air cavalry troop as a Cobra gunship pilot and became an aircraft commander and served well and did real well. He came back to the U.S. On Hamburger Hill. He served with the most famous unit, as we talked about, 3rd of the 187th Rocket Sounds, and he will be talking about that this morning. But when he came back, the true hero that he is, he joined the California Highway Patrol and was one of the original founders of California Highway Patrol aviation operations. He established the first operations at Fresno, and then came over here and established aviation operations here at Thermal that's still ongoing today. He has saved many, many lives, both military and civilian, and his legacy continues to this day. I'd like to introduce my hero, Lieutenant Colonel Col Bresnahan.
Morning. Everybody hear me all the way in the back of the room?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Too quiet? Okay.
You might have to hold it right up to your
A lot of hands. Let's see if I can get closer. Is that a little better? No.
Go ahead and talk, Dan. We'll
See if we can turn the volume up. Is that better back there? Okay, good. That's good. Good morning. My presentation today, as Lew said, concerns the infantry battle during the Vietnam War by the 101st Airborne Division on Dong Ngoc Bia, which is sometimes known as Hill 937, which is its altitude in meters on the maps, but it's more commonly known as Hamburger Hill. And it got that name because of the massive casualties that were incurred by both sides, the U.S. and the NVA at that time, and it occurred got to get past all this high-tech stuff here. It occurred on this green, innocuous-looking triple canopy jungle-covered hill mass, which from the air doesn't really look like much. It looks like every other mountain in Vietnam. Last month's presentation, as Lew said, was made by Lew on this same subject, but it was basically from an aviation standpoint, whereas my presentation this month is from an infantry standpoint. And again, as he said, I was one of only 5 of the original lieutenants out of the entire battalion, the 3rd of the 187th Infantry, that survived from the beginning until the end of that action. Due to the fact that this is a breakfast meeting, a forum which is really inappropriate to discuss all the gory details of that battle. Instead, what I will address today is the aviation, artillery, medical, and logistical support that was provided during that entire action. Everybody got involved in supporting us on the ground, much more than most people realize. reading about it in the news media or seeing the books and movies. I'll only talk about today the extensive incidents that I was actually involved in, even though you should understand that this isn't special to my existence. It really is typical for what everybody in the whole command was going through. It was just a good opportunity for me today to talk specifically about the things that I had firsthand knowledge of. Also, I apologize for a lot of these pictures. There's not a lot of them, and those that I do have, many of them, the quality isn't that good. But you have to remember that we were a little busy at the time, and photography was not one of our priorities. I think you'll see what I mean when you see some of these pictures. The Ashaw Valley that this is a picture of just shows one portion of it looking north from the center of the valley. And the valley was basically about 20 miles southwest of the city of Hue, and basically butted right up against the Laotian border on the west side of Vietnam. And this valley was fed by a web of trails and roads commonly known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it was not just one trail, it was a web of them. Came down from North Vietnam basically through Laos to bypass the DMZ and all the Americans that were present there, and entered South Vietnam, basically right here in the Ashaw Valley. A little bit to the north of those that are familiar with it was Quai Son, which was another familiar battle scene for the Marine Corps primarily. Between Quai Son and the Ashaw Valley was where all the trails from the Ashaw came into that part of South Vietnam. From this valley, during the Tet Offensive in 1968, the North Vietnamese Army, commonly known as the NVA, and their supporting Viet Cong guerrilla forces staged an attack against the city of Hue, which was the ancient imperial capital of all of Vietnam at one time, hundreds of years ago. The NVA decided, or somebody decided, that the NVA implemented a program to destroy all the leadership, civilian leadership, in the area around Hue. By this I mean they literally assassinated thousands of personnel, including not only the religious personnel of all denominations that weren't specific to any one religion, all the political leaders, and all the teachers and administrators, any type of government official, all were assassinated. And this is just one of the many graveyards in the Hue area. All the little white circles that you see there are individual graves from the mass murders. A lot of them are in clusters because quite a few people at one time were killed and buried together in these cemeteries. In response to all these deaths primarily, which were just an incredible portion of the whole invasion of 10 to 68, some of these types of things were common throughout Vietnam. Hue was kind of the focal point for the mass murders, and in regards to that, or in response to that, the U.S. government sent the 101st Airborne Division into the area to try to find and destroy all those enemy forces and their supplies. My unit, along with the others in the 101st, started in the coastal plains, which is where most of the big cities were in Vietnam, and they immediately proceeded into the triple canopy mountain jungles immediately west of the coastal plains, and that continued all the way to the Laotian border, about 30 miles to the west. So as we started into those mountains, it was about 3,000-foot peaks on average, 100-degree temperatures, and close to 100% humidity. That was kind of our daily environment for the infantry slogging through the jungle. And at first it was a beautiful jungle. You hate that there was a war going on because it was just a spectacular wilderness area with all kinds of nature that you just wouldn't believe was all around you. Gibbon monkeys in the trees, 6-foot-long monitor lizards that looked like alligators in the creek beds, along with a million leeches, which we could have done without. And butterflies as big as your hands. It was really spectacular, and you're almost in awe walking through the jungle because you expected it to be combat, and this was something spectacular to look at. But very quickly we started encountering some trails, and again very quickly those minor trails, a lot of foot wide, became bigger, more heavily used, more evidence of the enemy in the area. And in this area at I Corps, the northernmost division area of South Vietnam, it was just us and the bad guys, which made it simple as far as fighting the war, because we didn't have to worry about being in areas where there were civilian villagers, that there might be friendly fire or something bad happened to the innocent citizens that lived there. Where we were, it wasn't inside of our perimeter, it was the bad guys. And we could shoot, use drop bombs, call artillery without any concern about accidentally hitting the wrong people. And as I said, we progressed, or as we progressed further west, we found more and more activity. We started finding some hooches and then actual hooch complexes. For those interested in real estate, here's a little one-room fixer-upper that we found along the way. Comes complete with an elegant master bedroom suite, something for everybody there. And below it was a basement, better known as a bunker. We'll take note of the person in the middle there, that young, good-looking, dark-haired lieutenant. It's hard for me to look at that without breaking up, because in that picture I looked like I was about 12 years old. Also, I'm guessing from this picture, it must have been a relatively cool day, because I was only half covered in perspiration in this picture. As we progressed through the area, we started finding other evidence of the enemy, including huge weapons caches. This one was one of the biggest we ever found. It seems like it was an Easter egg hunt. Every bush had weapons and ammunition and other supplies stored under it. And for hours, we rounded up everything we could find. It was mostly laying out on the ground, sort of camouflaged, but there was no attempt. It was too much for it to have been buried underground. So we started stockpiling all this in huge piles, while others of us started cutting an LZ. And all day long, dozens and dozens of helicopters hauled tons of supplies away. Middle of this picture, just for reference for those that have never seen these things before, that big pile in the middle is artillery rounds. Off to the left of that, the left side of the picture, that rectangular, those rectangular cans are actually machine gun belted ammunition. And in the lower right, it's kind of hard to make out, I realize in this picture, is a somewhat mangled pile of destroyed machine gun barrels, which were not from this area. There's no evidence that this happened in the area, but we're guessing that probably all those machine gun barrels were exposed in a napalm attack and melted all the barrels. If you can see the details at all, you'll notice the barrels are all bent and warped, just like a Salvador Dali picture of a clock. It's sort of the same idea. Why they stored them and kept them, we have no idea. It seemed like just trash that you throw out. Interesting thing about this, and you can't make it out, it's a little bird or small game snare in the middle that the NBA used to supplement their diets, which mostly consisted of fish and rice. And the interesting thing about this was that they were meticulous planners, and they camouflaged everything to the point where we couldn't even find it. We had to look for all the things we did find. But this one, as you can see, is out in plain sight. This happened to be in the middle of a trail that we were walking on. And all we can figure out on this is that this is when we're getting closer to the Ashal Valley, and we assumed that they were getting so confident in their ability that they didn't care if we knew they were there. This is sort of a typical scene of a jungle, a little bit of a trail. Kind of a little audience participation here. If you look at this picture, try to discern what's in this picture that makes it important. I'll give you a little bit of a clue. Kind of on the right side of the picture, you can just barely make out a little bit of a trail there. And it obviously is not used very much because it's all overgrown. It's not an open trail where the ground is packed. And the reason this was particularly significant is, and I'll tell you a little story here about this. Normally, whenever we patrolled, we were led through the jungle of wherever else we were going by a two-man point and slackman team. And they were picked for that job because of their experience in the jungle and their ability to detect things on their own without any other guidance or supervision. My primary point man in this case was a guy by the name of Eddie Brooks. He was a good old boy, a hunter and tracker, from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. He spent his whole life in the woods, and this was a natural environment for him. And he could see things and smell things and detect things that we didn't have a clue was going on around us. A lot of us were city boys, and you really needed somebody that was totally comfortable in the jungle to lead you, and that's what Eddie did. We always did what Eddie said, because he was always right. There was never a time when he was wrong. If he said turn left, we turned left. If he said stop, we stopped. And in this case, he told us all to stop. And the reason is for what he found in this picture. And you can give your eyes a break, you will not see what's in this picture, but it's there. On that trail is a tripwire attached to a 250-pound Mark 81 bomb that had apparently been dropped by a fighter bomber somewhere else, didn't explode, and the NVA hauled to this location, hooked it up to a tripwire and camouflaged the whole thing. Eddie saw this, but none of the rest of us did. He was worth his weight in gold when he did these kinds of things, and he was doing these kinds of things every day. Our lives were totally indebted to him and one other point man that we had that rotated duties between morning and afternoon to give him a break. In this case, we brought the whole platoon up one at a time and let them look at this scene. Not one of us, not one, out of the whole platoon could see what's going on in this picture. We were standing right there looking at it, but Eddie could see it. You'll hear more about him a little bit later in the presentation. Ahead of us in the A-shot, at this point was only about 3 miles ahead of us in the jungle. And we had all kinds of intelligence gathering organizations trying to find out what was in the A-shot. The people sniffer aircraft, which were aircraft that had a device in it that sampled large quantities of air, and they were able to detect the presence of humans by literally detecting the ammonia in their urine. The machine was sophisticated enough that it could tell the difference between human and animal urine because of the difference in our diets. So that was a fascinating little device, and they started reporting large enemy troop concentrations in the A-shot. Along with that, that information, I should say, is backed up by 5-band long-range recon patrols, better known as LRPs, short acronym for their description. And they were out there sneaking through the jungle, trying to be invisible. Their job was never to be found or engage the enemy, but simply to observe everything that was going on. And they were reporting the same thing that the people sniffer aircraft were, that there's lots of bad guys out here. We also had radio intelligence units that monitored enemy communications and were able to detect many high-level communications by headquarters. They also said, obviously, if there's those kinds of headquarters, that means there's lots of subordinate units floating around out there somewhere. Typically, we never heard from them on the radio, or they were never monitored, because in company and even battalion level, the NVA tended not to use radios at all. They just didn't have them. They used runners, or I don't know what, guys with flags, I guess, but they didn't have radio communications. Another way that they found a lot of intelligence, particularly in the A-Shaw Valley, this is an OV-1 Mohawk aircraft with side-looking airborne radar, SLAR for short. That's that cigar-shaped pod below the nose of the aircraft. And unlike the radar that you might be familiar with in your aircraft that can tell or spot other aircraft around you, or bad weather ahead of you, or even terrain approaching in front of you, this aircraft radar didn't function like that at all. If you picture a man swishing back and forth with his broom on the sidewalk, that's basically the way this radar on the aircraft worked. As the aircraft flew along, it would sweep the radar back and forth, left and right, and detect everything below the aircraft and on either side. That was then displayed on a screen in the cockpit of the aircraft to the man whose job it was to monitor what the radar was seeing. In this case, they were flying Highway 548, which ran the length of the A-Shaw Valley, and they were detecting hundreds of trucks, NVA trucks, every day going up and down, carrying supplies and endless troops. And sometimes they were towing bulldozers and even artillery. The problem is that none of the information that I just gave you that was gathered by all these intelligence agencies was ever passed along to the infantry. We were just out there slogging through the jungle. Nobody ever told us about all the bad stuff, except go out there and find the bad guys. For those that weren't aware that the NBA had artillery or don't believe it, here's a picture that I took 2 years later after Hamburger Hill when I was on my aviation tour in Lew Jennings' unit. We found a Russian 122 millimeter artillery battery, including their tracked prime movers that towed these artillery pieces. Just to give you an idea of how big that is, the barrel on that gun is as big as a telephone pole. It's a huge gun. And we found 3 of them. I'm not sure how many were supposed to be in an NBA battery. We discovered 3 in the tracked prime movers. We immediately inserted a South Vietnamese Army Special Ops unit called the Hakbao, which stands for Black Panther. They went in on the ground and spiked each gun barrel by putting thermite grenades in the breech. Thermite grenades, contrary to the Hollywood movies you see where the guy throws a grenade and explodes, thermite grenades don't explode. They simply burn at several thousand degrees, and that we use that in the breeches to melt down the inside of the barrels so they couldn't be used anymore. Then we extracted the team, and obviously in those pictures, called an airstrike in and dropped bombs on them. This was the best of the 3 pictures that I had. The other 2 pieces were upside down in the dirt and somewhat destroyed. Now back to the story on Hamburger Hill. This is the Ashaw Valley looking north, and that ridge line in the distance on the right is about 4,000 feet high, to give you a sense of scale here. All the jungle, the dark jungle on the hills is triple canopy, and the trees that you see visible on the top of the forest are about 200-foot tall teak and mahogany trees. Also on the right side of the picture, you can see all the white colored circles on the ground. That's where a B-52 arc light went in. That's one string of 3 that goes in. Each of those little white circles is a crater about 40 feet across and about 10 feet deep, just to give you an idea roughly what you're looking at. Forward air controllers from the Air Force often worked the valley here, and if they didn't have a mission from the infantry, they would look for possible sites that the NBA might be, looking through their binoculars in the aircraft. To this, they would determine, well, that's a suspicious site, so I'll put an airstrike in on that. In this case, they put an airstrike in on that 4,000-foot bridge on the right side, and immediately had secondary explosions, which don't happen very much, but when it does happen, it almost always is because the bombs dropped and exploded on a cache of either ammunition or even petroleum, gasoline, and 55-gallon drums. In this case, the bombs went boom, and then there was secondary explosions in the area all around it. So obviously there's something big on the ground there, and the decision was made to put some infantry on the ground to take a look at it. In this case, even though Lew Jennings' unit was an aviation unit, it had, as part of its air cavalry reconnaissance mission, an infantry platoon. So they put their infantry platoon on the ground to look and see what caused the secondary explosions. Unfortunately for them, when they got on the ground, they were immediately attacked by a very large enemy force, and they immediately called for help. In response to that, they rounded up our Bravo company from our infantry battalion and put them in, not down on the lower LZ where the 2nd 17th Infantry Platoon was, but on an upper LZ. Tactically in the infantry, you always want to start or be on the high ground and fight your way down, as opposed to starting on the low ground and fight your way up. So that's what they did with the Bravo company that came in to back up the 2nd 17th. They put them in on an LZ just below the top of the 4,000-foot peak. They were flown in by 158th Aviation, which is a lift battalion, Huey battalion. It carries all the infantry and the supplies, drops off the mail, whatever. That's who flew the Bravo company in. Unfortunately, from the opening moment when they went in, they had 4 helicopters shot down, and lots of casualties. In this picture, again, I realize the quality is not so great. The upper left happens to be the Huey that the aviation unit commander was in. He was wounded, his co-pilot was killed. The other 2 more aircraft there in kind of the middle right of the picture. This is a better picture of those 2 helicopters, both laying on their side, the one to the right, obviously in what I call the dying cockroach position. You've got to remember now, each of these Hueys, in addition to the 4 crew members that were strapped in and went along for the ride, there was a whole bunch of infantry in the back that aren't strapped in at all. So as these helicopters crashed, the infantry were just spit out all through the clearing. And there was lots of casualties, both in the air crews and in the infantry. In response to this, they called my company up, Alpha Company, 3rd of the 187, to come in and back up Bravo, because only portions of their company got on the ground, little pieces of 2 different platoons. So we brought my platoon in. We were also transported by 158th Aviation, and we were briefed en route in the helicopter that they were going to, because this helicopter was blocked by a 4th helicopter that was shot down trying to put Bravo Company in. That helicopter that was shot down blocked the helicopter, blocked the LZ. It actually had relatively minor damage in the scheme of things. What happened, it got on the ground, took a round right through the hydraulic reservoir, caused it to lose all the hydraulic fluid, and as a result, they couldn't fly it off the LZ. But it blocked the LZ, even though, as you can see, there's lots of room in the LZ. There was only one place that a helicopter could actually land. That's generally called a one-ship LZ. So my company was en route, in the air, got briefed. We were going to be placed into the lower LZ and fight our way up the hill, the exact opposite of the way we wanted to do it. But there's no way we could land here. It was blocked. While we were en route, just minutes away, this is where something magical happened that I'd never seen before or after, or even heard stories about. The crew chiefs, the surviving crew chiefs of these downed helicopters, got together, took a look at that helicopter blocking the LZ, discovered that it only had 1 round through the hydraulic reservoir, and they were able to cannibalize spare parts out of all these destroyed helicopters, put a functioning tank into the damaged helicopter, and somehow came up with enough hydraulic fluid to fill the tank. Then they loaded that helicopter with as many casualties as they could fly out of there and left for the hospital. Well, that all happened. I don't know how long it took them to replace it, but the decision for them to load the patients and take off happened in minutes. And we were only a couple of minutes away, just about to land in the lower LZ. And we knew we were in short final, so I had already stood out on the skid, ready to go. And as I'm looking outside the aircraft, instead of seeing the lower LZ and 4,000 feet of ridgeline above me, I'm looking at this LZ. We're just about to land on this LZ. So I started yelling at the pilot, probably call him a name or two, that, hey, dummy, you're putting us on the wrong LZ. We don't belong here. But you know how these pilots are, they ignore the passengers in the back and do what the hell they want to do anyway. So we wound up being put in, at least they started to put us in here, and it was still a hot LZ. When the crew chiefs were repairing this aircraft that they departed in, it was still under fire. How the heck they ever had time to cannibalize parts, fix the damaged helicopter and fly it out of there, I have no clue. But bullets were still flying. There was bad guys out there not wanting us to be on their property. Well, I came in on the first helicopter and made it to the ground safely. This is actually the second helicopter in my platoon. Now, if you look at the guy in the foreground with his arms outstretched, just to the right of his head, there's a light-colored tree stump all broken off by the artillery. I'm crouched down right at the base of that tree stump. And some of my platoon guys running off to the left. They've just gotten out of that helicopter that's still hovering. Nobody waits around. You have 5 seconds on the ground from the time the ship first comes in to be out, and you better be off that aircraft in 5 seconds, or you're going for a ride, and you'll probably sustain a severe beating by the crew chief for not getting out of the helicopter in the first place. The guy in the foreground with his arms outstretched, later that same day, he was killed in an NDA mortar attack. And just to the lower left of the picture, you can see another man's head just at the bottom of the picture. He was wounded. Those 2 guys were both helicopter crew members from the previously shot down helicopters. And also during that same mortar attack, my radio telephone operator, radio man, was killed in the mortar attack. Now back to this picture. This is the second helicopter. Again, I'm crouched down behind that tree. The third helicopter came in 5 seconds later and hovered right where this one is. And it no more than came to a hover. My infantry guys hadn't even jumped out yet. And an RPG, a rocket grenade, went right over my head and struck that helicopter and blew it up and crashed and burned right there on the LZ. You can see that from that stump to the tree, I was maybe 10 feet away, and the rotor blades are turning right over my head. So when this explosion occurred and the helicopter crashed, it was happening right there where I was. This is a picture of that helicopter after everything was over. You can see the whole body of the aircraft is burned away. There's nothing left but white ash. And maybe the last 15 feet of the tailboom is still there. This whole LZ was the only place on Earth that we controlled at the moment. Our job was to keep everybody from closing in on us on that LZ. And this went on for several days. Each time we would try and patrol off in a different direction, we got major attacks by the NVA, until finally we worked our way actually to the back of this side of the LZ, and we found a huge trail, part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. Instead of 1 foot wide, like we'd expect a little jungle trail to be, this one was like a highway. It was 5 feet wide, all the way up the hillside. It was paved with bamboo planks to make steps going up the mountain. On one side of the steps was a handrail, and every so often on the handrail was a wooden platform at about waist height. So the NVA, carrying these huge loads on their back going up the hill, could simply rest the load on those platforms without sitting down and resting. On the other side of that trail was a ramp, also made of bamboo, and the NVA could walk up the steps and push bicycles up the ramp. That was the only purpose of the ramp, was to push bicycles. And they were loaded with 200 or 300 pounds of equipment, which was a primary way that they moved supplies through the jungle. We would need the Corps of Engineers to build a 4-lane highway and helicopters to fly stuff in. They did everything on their back. Basically, their whole army operated that way. And as we fought our way off the LZ and found this trail, our platoon, or our company, decided to start down this trail towards the floor of the A-Shaw, because obviously it was a big deal. We wanted to see what was going on. And we found about 1 day's walk apart was Hooch Complex. And it was like Motel 6. This is where all the NVA were staging from as they walked down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam. They were staying in these hooch complexes. And this was very sophisticated compared to the little hooch you saw earlier in the presentation. These hooches had underground bunkers with stoves in them and 2 bamboo pipelines running from there. One took the smoke from the stoves out hundreds of meters into the jungle and disseminated it, so that even if the smoke rose up to the trees and the American aircraft spotted the smoke and shot at it, all they'd hit is trees. They were a long way from where the hooches actually were. The other pipeline in the hooches actually brought fresh water in from the streams nearby into the hooches. So here we were living in the jungle. These guys had hot and cold running water in their hooches in the Inshaw Valley. Over the next few days, as we found all this stuff, back up on this LZ, the Army decided to build an entire fire base here and clear all the rubble and destroyed aircraft that you see there, flew in artillery and an infantry company to provide perimeter defense for them, set up, as I said, a fully operating fire base. At the same time as that, Lew Jennings unit, 2nd 17th Cav, continued their aerial reconnaissance, and about 4 miles southwest of there, they found a roughly 3-inch wide coaxial cable that's about the size of my wrist coming up out of Laos and up the west slope of Dong Ngap Bia, which became Hamburger Hill. The decision was made right away that whatever is up there, it's really big to have a coax cable like that. So the 101st decided to put the entire 3rd Brigade and several thousand soldiers in on the peaks around there to find out what's going on there. First, they decided they were going to fly everybody in because it's too far to walk. So they had one of the largest air mobile assaults ever conducted during the Vietnam War up to that time. Just about all the aviation assets of the entire 101st Airborne were being utilized to pre-position everybody onto several fire bases nearby Dong Ngap Bia. In this case, a Chinook helicopter flying artillery in, CH-54 flying crane, usually carried the biggest and heaviest loads. At the same time as this, all the lift units, the Huey units, were flying the 3 infantry battalions into various staging areas. That was on the 9th of May. This is a picture actually of my battalion being flown in to stage at this location, resupply, restock, get everything we need, get organized, because the next day, the 10th of May, was going to be the beginning of the assault on Dong Ngap Bia. Picture of the same scene. from here, as I said, we staged on the night of the 9th. First thing, dawn basically, in the morning of the 10th, they began a huge barrage. First of airstrikes, every fighter bomber in the Pacific, I think, came and dropped bombs on several different peaks in the area, including Dong Not Be itself and a couple of other hilltops that our infantry was going to use as landing zones. As soon as the aircraft stopped dropping bombs, the artillery started firing. Obviously, they had to wait for the airspace to be clear. They started firing every type of artillery we had, which included 105, 155, 8-inch, and 175 millimeter artillery. This is the second of the smallest. This is 155 artillery. The biggest was 175, and it was a tracked vehicle. Instead of a towed vehicle, it's got its own armored tracks. And it's roughly 3 times the size of this, just to give you an idea of the size of some of that artillery. At this point, there was 10 of those artillery batteries firing on a couple of different hilltops, which sounds pretty doggone impressive, and it really was to listen to or see if you were close enough to see it. But with all of that explosions going on, first the airstrikes and then the artillery, the final thing was flying in helicopter gunships with 7.62 aerial rockets and 7.62 4,000 round miniguns and the rockets I just mentioned and 40 millimeter grenade launchers. They were used primarily to prep the actual landing zones where they were going to put the infantry. And as I said, this went on for over an hour. It was an incredible barrage. You could hear probably for 10 miles around there, just an unbelievable cacophony that was going on. And in spite of all this, and this is sort of roughly comparable to the preparatory fires on Iwo Jima in World War II, or even the Normandy beaches in D-Day in World War II, that they had about the same effect as those two. In other words, all they did with all that explosion was kill a bunch of trees. Amazingly, the NBA just kind of hung around and waited for the Americans to continue to see what they were going to do next. I think they pretty much knew what was coming next, but they just kept quiet, didn't show themselves at all. The morning of the 10th started the actual, after the barrages and everything, our unit was picked up by the 158th Aviation. We were already in the air when the helicopter gunships finished their preparatory rounds on the actual LZs, who within a minute of landing, this is an actual picture of that, the whole battalion on this LZ got on the ground without so much as one round being fired either at us or from us. The only casualty in the whole battalion attack was one guy that jumped out of a helicopter too soon and broke his leg. So amazingly, after 2 weeks before being through all the problems on airborne while the helicopters were shot down, we thought that's the way this was going to go, and it was sort of anticlimactic. So we got on the ground on the 10th, the whole battalion. Our battalion was on this LZ. There was 2 other battalions on the south side of Dong Not being partially one on the east side. But not one of us really going in had any real problems, major casualties or anything. But again, the NBA were just waiting for us to come to them. We'll get to that and why in just a second. Each time, over the next 10 days, everything changed right away after the second day. The first day, not much going on, as I said. But then each time, each of the battalions by company started heading up towards the hill, towards Dong Not Bia, all of a sudden all hell broke loose. Because what the NVA had up there was the entire 29th NVA regiment, and it was totally underground, in a buried command post. Their entire force was underground. The headquarters, the supply rooms, the building and mess facility, all of that was in an underground complex. It was surrounded by 2 interconnected lines of underground bunkers, connected by tunnels, so that no NVA ever had to come out on the surface of the ground and expose himself. They were totally camouflaged to the extent that we literally, even though we were looking, we could not see the bunkers. And the lead elements, which I was not one, the lead elements as they walked up the hill, they encountered the outer bunker without even knowing they were there. And what happened was the enemy fired the first shots, at the Americans. They had several things going for them. First of all, we couldn't see them in their underground bunkers. And just to give you an idea, each of the bunkers were closer together than the front and back of this room. And they were all able to support each other. So any one bunker could support the bunkers on either side also. So as our guys walked in there, the enemy opened up with everything. They had RPG rockets, machine guns. They fired mortars from the other side of the hill. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the NVA, being the clever people that they were, they had mounted 3-foot wide claymore mines up in the backs of the trees facing themselves. So as the Americans walked up, expecting the bad guys to be to their front, they walked past the trees that had the claymore mines in it. The NVA just held their breath until lots of our guys were forward of those trees. Then they blew the claymores in our backs and wiped out lots and lots of Americans doing that. So right away it went from not much going on to major casualties, all in that one area. Battalions on the other side of the mountain were also starting to encounter some of this. The regimental complex was huge underground. The whole inside the mountain was honeycombed with rooms and tunnels. To kind of give you an idea, kind of give you a better understanding of what I mean, you'll keep hearing this phrase, massive casualties. The full impact is kind of hard to explain it to you, even though I say it 100 times. But the official casualty numbers for the brigade at the end of the action was 74 killed and 374 wounded. But that gives you a false sense also, because in our battalion alone, almost everybody was wounded, but only half were actually Medevac. And it very quickly became clear that if you weren't really unconscious or dead, you were going to stay there and keep fighting, because whatever your injuries were wasn't bad as the other guy. So I'll stay here and let him get Medevac.
How many people were in the average battalion?
In the field, we probably had about maybe 300 to 400, just depending. None of the units were anywhere near their authorized strength. We'll get to that in just a second. That large number of casualties that were occurring on a daily basis, it never stopped day and night, and it just totally overwhelmed our medics, who unfortunately often themselves also became casualties and either had to treat themselves or be treated by infantry personnel. At the same time, the 326 Medical Detachment, which was our Medevac helicopter unit for the whole division, they had to do multiple Medevacs because of the different hilltops with battalions on them. They had to do multiple Medevacs with multiple patients all at the same time, and many times doing mass casualties transport. And they instantly ran out of helicopters. Through no fault of their own, they weren't goofing off, they just literally ran out of helicopters. There were so many Medevacs and so many patients. This often required us to use our resupply Hueys, who weren't equipped and manned to take care of patients, but that was the only other mechanism we had to remove all the casualties from the scene, was to load them on the resupply helicopters and have them flown to the rear. At the same time, the Division Medical Battalion set up a triage facility at Firebase Blaze, where our battalion staged before the attack on Hamburger Hill. That they set it up to basically use the golden hour, which is the word, kind of the phrase used right now in the medical community, to indicate the first hour is the most important hour for the survival and welfare of the patient. If you can get them to advance life support in that amount of time, they're pretty much, unless they died instantly, pretty much got a good chance of surviving. And that's what was going on. We were at the front lines where all the battle was going on. There was no place for a helicopter to land in general. And it was not safe anyway, because bullets and machine gun bullets and RPGs were going everywhere. So the helicopters tended not to go there. They went to a battalion LZ, which was about almost an hour's walk to the rear. And then what we had to do when we did have the casualties, just commonly, was to carry the patients down from the front line at almost an hour back to the battalion LZ, where either lift Hueys could transport or actual Medevac helicopters. And in addition, even though I just told you that helicopters couldn't land up at the front because there was no good place to land, and also they would have got shot down instantly. Believe it or not, there was actually a Brigade OH-6 Loach pilot. That's just what the hill looked like after all the bombardment. And actually, this is several hundred meters down below the top of the hill. The top of the hill was totally vaporized and nothing left but matchsticks. This, even though this looks pretty devastating compared to triple canopy jungle, that's several hundred meters down from the top. And here's a scene at the battalion LZ with the actual medevac ships landing and patients being put aboard. I started to tell you about the OH-6. We had one guy, that's him flying the aircraft, Eric Reardon, and he's a hero to our whole unit because he actually was able to maneuver in, even though there was no good place to land, he maneuvered in under the trees and found some way to land or even hold it to hover while bullets are going everywhere, and guys would just throw casualties in the back of the aircraft, and he would fly them either back to the battalion LZ or even over to Blaze to the triage facility they had set up there. Eric, all by himself, medevac dozens, if not hundreds, of personnel from the front line, which not only saved them, but also kept the other infantry from having to carry the wounded back to the battalion LZ. He not only is a hero, he's also a celebrity because big articles about crazy Reardon were in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, in a lot of the American newspapers. He got personal cards and letters from President Nixon commending him for the things he was doing. That's how big he was known. This picture happens to be in a moment when nobody's shooting. This just happened to be another clearing. And the guy in the front of the picture, in front of the helicopter, running with a steel pot in one hand and a rifle in the other, that's our battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, who's now a Brigadier General, retired, of course. And he still comes to our Hamburger Hill reunions every year. He's a kid. Very entertaining guy. So the loss of personnel, the massive casualties that we had, actually totally devastated the unit. We were losing track of who was injured, where they went, to such an extent that they actually had to use the battalion JAG clerk who normally processes Article 15s. He was kind of spare at that moment, so they had him go to every hospital in Northern Icor from Da Nang North, and even the Navy hospital ships at sea, to ascertain which of our people had been sent there and whether they were alive or dead and where they were going after that. He was also able to bring back a lot of equipment that happened to have been transported to the hospital with the wounded soldier. We got one replacement in. He's a totally new, inexperienced soldier. He arrived by helicopter in the morning, got wounded in medevac later that same afternoon, never spent one night in the jungle in combat. That was his entire combat tour that day. And a lot of us in the battalion wished we could have had a combat tour like that. It's a heck of a way to go through your tour. In addition to all those wounded that obviously needed care and transport, we also had the Graves Registration Unit taking care of all the dead. And unfortunately for them, their workload was incredible also. Normally in normal battle times, they might have one or two people that they had to take care of and process, whereas during Hamburger Hill, not one or two, they had 74 over 10 days. So they were overwhelmed by all that too. Then on the 13th, the fourth day of the operation, 10 days, we had two major disasters occur. The first was back on Firebase Airborne, where all the helicopters had been shot down 2 weeks before that. The NVA overran that firebase in the middle of the night and killed and wounded dozens and dozens of people and destroyed quite a number of the artillery tubes that were up there. I think the total count on airborne was 22 killed and 61 wounded, just on that one instance only. Later that same day, our Delta Company of our infantry battalion was down in a steep, narrow ravine, and they happened to incur a couple of casualties, which were not that bad at the time, only a couple. Anyway, a helicopter medevac helicopter showed up unexpectedly. Nobody thought it was going to be there. And since there was no place for it to land, it began to do hoist missions. This picture is not of Hamburger Hill at all, but I'm just using it to illustrate the point. This is a typical medevac. The medic is out on the skid guiding the cable with his hand, and at the other end of the cable is a patient on what they call a jungle penetrator. You've probably seen medevacs done where they have a big mesh basket called a Stokes litter if they're prone, but oftentimes there's not enough room to do that in the jungle. Some clever person invented this thing called a jungle penetrator. It's somewhat like a boat anchor, if you picture a boat anchor that the person's sitting on, and the two blades of the boat anchor fold up so that it can be dropped down through the trees without getting stuck in the trees. And then on the ground, the medic opens the arms, puts the patient on it, and there's actually a strap that goes around the guy's back. So even if he's unconscious and can't take care of himself, he's not coming off that jungle penetrator. They can hoist him up even unconscious. And that's what the Medevac ship did over Delta Company. And there was no place to land. They were hovering, of course, on top of 200-foot trees. Luckily, their cable was long enough to get down to the patient. They'd already hoisted a couple of patients up into the helicopter when the NVA shot this down with an RPG rocket. And it crashed right on top of Delta Company's headquarters and incurred a whole bunch more casualties. So because of that, obviously no helicopter can go in there. They had lots of casualties now. They sent my platoon down in the canyon, and then later on a second platoon, simply to bring out, hand carry all the patients out. When we got down there, and this is a good example of how the serious numbers of casualties were affecting us, my platoon was authorized 46 people. I never had anywhere near that. I might have had 30 on a good day. But in this day, I had 19. So when I got down there and found out how many casualties there was no way we had enough people to transport all the wounded. That's when we immediately called for another platoon to come down and help. What we started doing was to try and transport by hand the people out of the canyon. But by then, it had already become night and it started raining heavily, and the whole hillside turned into a muddy, slippery quagmire. We could barely move. Normally, we'd use 4 people, one on each side of a poncho, to carry one wounded person ahead. In this case, I only had enough people to put 2 people on each poncho. So what we had to do was pick up a victim, move them 50 to 100 feet, set them down, go back and get another one. And we just shuttle them. Get rid of that microphone before I'm done here. They carried her as far as they could, but not too far, because you didn't want to lay people out there all by themselves and be outside your area that you could defend them in. So we started carrying them up the hillside, but it was obviously going to take all night to do that, which is pretty much the way it went. And we just did the best we could and waited for that second platoon, and it turns out that the only surviving crew member of that Medevac helicopter was one of the 2 pilots. All the other crew members died in the crash. And that crew member, a pilot, lost his leg in the crash. My medic kept him alive all night long. It turns out that now that guy stayed in the in the medical field his whole life, not aviation, the medical field his whole life, and is just now retired as the CEO of a hospital in Columbia, Missouri. And the important point there is it goes to show you when you save somebody's life, you never know how important they're going to become later on. During that 10-day battle, all the military assets of Vietnam, everything was being used by everybody, became available to us. If we needed something or wanted something, all we had to do was ask for it, and they brought in unbelievable amounts of stuff, more than we could ever begin to use, but at least there was no questions asked, no argument. If it was available, it came to us. Now, once again, just like the preparatory fires, we'd been doing that every day before we started up the hillsides, and it sort of became a daily ritual that the day was going to start off with aerial bombardments and then artillery runs and then helicopter gunships. And they were also available anytime that we were actually moving, that we wanted them with us while we were moving. But they were, each artillery unit was supporting so many locations at the same time that their guns never had time to cool off. They fired 24 hours a day, and their gun barrels, you have to see this to believe it, I wish I had a picture. The gun barrels glowed red hot 24 hours a day. The gun crews, who were normally used to firing 15, 20 minutes and their mission was over, That's all they did, 24 hours a day. How they manned those guns and kept firing for all that amount of time, I have no idea. At the same time, when they weren't firing, particularly in the daytime, the fighter bombers were still dropping bombs, even napalm, on every hillside around there repeatedly. And the airstrikes eventually dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs and something like 50 missions a day, which was an unbelievable workload on the forward air controllers, but somehow they did it. Also, if you can't picture in your mind the scale of this thing, there was only one peak where all this was going on, and an U.S. infantry battalion on each side, but the facts would be conflicting with each other trying to put in fighter bombs. If they both tried to work, they couldn't work over the top of the hill. One worked on the north side and only orbited on the north side. The other one worked on the south side and stayed there. So not only did the facts have to stay away from the top of the hill, but so did the fighter bombers, which further increased the difficulty in the directions the facts had to give to the fighter bombers on their run directions, which way they could come in and which way they had to break and go out. The artillery, due to its firing, as I said, 24 hours a day, believe it or not, they fired over 19,000 rounds, which equated to about 513 tons of artillery ammunition fired during that time. And the sad point of all this is during all this, there was at least 4 incidents of so-called friendly fire, where the U.S. fired on friendly forces. The first time, and this was all by helicopter gunships, normally when ground units, platoons, or companies call either airstrikes or artillery, they themselves do the calling and direct the airstrikes and artillery just to ensure that no friendly fire occurs on American units. Keeps it perfectly safe that way. But during Hamburger Hill, everything was taken over by the higher headquarters, who often didn't know exactly where the friendly units were on the ground. And this resulted in quite a few friendly fire incidents by the helicopter gunships. The first one was on our battalion headquarters, and that took out, killed 1 and wounded 20, and basically wiped out the command element of the whole battalion. Fortunately, the new companies were pretty much used to working on their own, so they were able to keep going. And in this case, because of the extreme number of casualties of the battalion, they sent my company in to help out with the wounded, take care of the people of the battalion. And one of the things that I was tasked to do with my platoon was to take care of running the LZ, which was used, called the battalion LZ, where all the Medevac ships came in and all the resupply Hueys came in. And it was like LAX or JFK Airport. That's the only way I can describe it. All day long, and even some of the night, pilots came in endlessly, just hundreds of helicopters every day, bringing supplies, bringing ammunition, food, water, you name it, also bringing replacement personnel, and sometimes carrying out the wounded because there weren't enough Medevac, actual Medevac helicopters to transport them. The second friendly fire incident, I'll come back to the supply in a minute. This is just some of the artillery fire. This is a picture of an LZ. This is not the same one as our battalion LZ, but it looked exactly the same. You can see supplies dumped all over. And that's the way it looked at our LZ all day for sure, and some of the night. And when the units were coming in, the helicopters were coming in, the units themselves, many of the people, that usually NCOs, that took care of ordering resupplies, and not only supplies, but reordering replacement personnel. When they themselves, the only ones in the unit that really knew what they needed and what had been ordered, were among the casualties. So when they gave me authority to run this LZ, it was like starting from zero. None of the units could even tell me what they were supposed to get. So all I could do with the new people coming in and the supply details was have them stack everything up in categories, as I said, food, water, ammo, radio gear, whatever. And then as the replacements came in, I'd have them carry supplies back to the companies with the supply detail from that company. So really kind of inventing this system from scratch. But it was so much pandemonium that there was one guy that came in on a resupply aircraft, a brand new replacement. He was so confused because he'd never been in combat, didn't know anything about anything. He gets off the aircraft, he didn't even know to what unit he was being assigned. He was just told, when the helicopter lands in the jungle, get out. That's the best guidance he was given. The second incident of friendly fire, in between these two things I just told you about, was a couple of days after the battalion got hit by gunships. And the second instance was my platoon. They got hit again by a gunship, made a minigun run through my platoon, 4,000 rounds a minute. And it was like stepping into a beehive. The whole jungle just came to life while these rounds were cranking through the trees all around me. At that moment, I happened to have 3 attached engineers laden with C4 explosives to go out and blow an LZ. That's the only reason we were going forward, was to escort these engineers to blow LZs. They were all 3 wounded, not one of them killed, but all 3 were wounded by the minigun fire. And if you remember Eddie Brooks, my point man, he was killed by the friendly fire. There was also 2 more instances I can't give the details on because I wasn't there, but it was similar to the 2 I just gave you. It involved helicopter gunships, and there were several casualties in those units also. And finally, there was almost one more friendly fire incident that again involved my platoon, but this time it wasn't helicopter gunships, it was fighter bombers. We were in the lead, well ahead of everybody else, which was a place you really didn't want to be. You didn't want to be the target, but that just happened to be where we were. And as we came up the side of the hill, we got to one of these 40-foot wide bomb craters. And it wasn't a B-52. This one, I think, was a delayed bomb, so that hit the ground and buried, and then exploded. So it dug a much bigger crater. It's about half the size of this room, to give you an idea how big it is. When my 2-point man went into that crater, I was still on the outside of the crater, when all of a sudden, instantly, the whole crater was filled with white smoke. And a moment later, my 2-point men came out, waving the smoke out of their faces and coughing, couldn't believe what the heck was that. And at the same time, I looked up and saw and heard a forward air controller breaking away after having fired a white phosphorus marking round at us, thinking we were NVA. He was about to drop bombs on us. And I knew that in seconds there would be a bomber doing just that. So I called ceasefire on every radio frequency I could think of. And luckily, the whole incident ended there. So to the best of my knowledge, there were no additional friendly fire incidents, and there was none that involved fighter bombers. Unfortunately, it was all our own helicopters that did it. On 17 May, in an attempt to dislodge the NVA from their underground complex, we tried one time to do a CS gas attack, hoping that that was going to gas them and get them to come out. This is an actual picture of some of my platoon leaders sitting there with their gas masks on and just waiting for the whole thing to occur. Only this whole thing was canceled almost instantly for a couple of reasons. First of all, the rounds were all delivered by artillery shells, which break open in the sky, streaming out the gas, and it settles down onto the ground. Gases whoever you're aiming for. In this case, the place in the sky where they chose to have the artillery shells split open was directly over my platoon, and it rained hot and heavy metal shell fragments down all around me, and we called ceasefire. Fortunately, no friendlies were hurt at all, but scared the hell out of us, because we didn't know. We knew it was going to be a gas attack. We were all sitting there with our masks on, but we had no idea these rounds were going to burst over us. We didn't know what the hell kind of weapon that was. We didn't know the enemy had anything like that. Turns out it was our own guys doing that. So we canceled the whole attack because of that. However, this led up to the final day of Hamburger Hill, and my M60 machine gunner wound up being the first guy on top of Hamburger Hill. That was just the luck of the draw. He was the first one there, and as soon as he got there, a lot of the others of us also got up. And again, it was sort of anticlimactic. After 10 days of nothing but explosions and mass casualties, everything just stopped. Like somebody blew a whistle and the game was over. And here we were after we swept the mountaintop, made sure there was no snipers or any tripwire booby traps. We were all standing around going, well, we made it on top. What's next? But it turns out the news media got word of it that we were on top, and they published it in all the news media, the newspapers. And After 10 days, just like the headline says, the fight's over, and we took the hill. So that concludes my boring presentation. Anybody have any questions? Put everybody to sleep.
Now,